Israel's war on Gaza has relied mostly on Western arms and technology to kill around 32,000 Palestinians. And despite growing opposition, those weapons keep flowing. So who's supplying Israel with the tools for genocide, and could there be legal consequences? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Israel has used the most modern military technology available to kill or maim more than 100,000 people in Gaza while reducing their communities to rubble. In the West, some of the world's richest companies are using their expertise, their engineers and technicians to support the conflict and boost their profits. Their high-tech munitions have taken the lives of defenseless civilians and infants as the world watches on. Yet Western politicians, notably in the US, are backing Israel as it carries out one of the most barbaric assaults on a defenseless community in world history. How can modern civilization allow such slaughter? And will there be legal consequences for those helping arm a genocidal war? We'll be asking our panel of guests these questions and more in a few moments. But first, this report from Kulsum Sharif on Israel's weapons suppliers.
Central to Israel's war on Gaza have been weapons and technology supplied by Western allies. The United States is Israel's largest supplier. According to an arms transfer database compiled by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Israel imports 68% of its weapons from the US. Those from Germany make up 28% of Israel's military imports, a tenfold rise on 2022. A UN report says the UK, Australia, Canada and France are also continuing supplies. They include aircraft, missiles, tanks, technology and ammunition, including components for the F-35 stealth bomber used to attack Gaza. But several countries have decided to stop supplying arms to Israel. They include the Netherlands, Belgium, Japan, Italy and Spain. While Israel has enjoyed strong support from some countries in the EU, its foreign policy chief has voiced his opposition to more arms sales.
How many times have you heard the most prominent leaders and foreign ministers around the world saying too many people are being killed? President Biden said this is too much on the top. It's not proportional. Well, if you believe that too many people are being killed, maybe you should provide less arms in order to prevent so many people being killed.
South Africa has accused Israel of genocide at the International Court of Justice, but it could take years before any verdict is reached. Human rights legal experts warn that sending weapons for the use in Gaza is likely to violate international human law. And in February, a court in the Netherlands ordered the country to halt the export of F-35 fighter jet parts to Israel. The US is not signatory to all the provisions of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, under which states are legally bound to prevent genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity. But opposition to military support for Israel is growing.
We're dropping some food and we're dropping the bombs and the tanks and the bullets and everything else at the same time. That's what he's got to do. Stop sending the money and the weapons.
Israel is coming under increasing criticism from countries and global institutions over its war on Gaza. Yet, that war could not continue without Western support. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all this with three experts in the field. In Washington, D.C. is Sarah Jaeger, the Washington Director of Human Rights Watch. In Amsterdam, Wendela de Vries is the co-founder of Stop Wapenhandel, an independent Dutch campaign opposed to arms trade. And also in Washington, D.C. is Brian Finucane. He's a senior advisor for the U.S. At the International Crisis Group, he focuses on developing policies and checks to decrease American reliance on military tools in foreign affairs. It's great to have all of you on the program. Ms. Yeager, I'll begin with you. Why has your organization, along with Oxfam, submitted this memorandum to the U.S. government saying that Israel's assurances that it's meeting U.S. law aren't credible?
Well, Oxfam as a humanitarian organization and Human Rights Watch as a human rights organization decided to come together and package the violations that we have seen Israel conduct in Gaza in one document that we could send in to the U.S. government and say, look, if you are not going to assess Israel's conduct, we will show you what we have seen. And Israel's assurances that it is going to use U.S. weapons to abide by international humanitarian law, that's the laws of war, should not be deemed credible.
Okay, it's interesting that you say, you've said to the U.S. government, if you are not going to analyze Israel's conduct, because, Mr. Finucane, I'll bring you in here. U.S. law requires officials to assess what a recipient of American military aid does with the weapons provided, does it not? Do you believe the Biden administration is doing this?
That's right. U.S. law, U.S. policy, and international law require the United States to undertake assessments and monitor how U.S. origin weapons are being used with respect to any partner to whom U.S. transfers them to. But the administration has repeatedly said that they're not undertaking assessments of law of war compliance by the IDF. At least in any sort of systematic fashion. And so it's really hard to see how the administration would credibly assess whether these assurances it's receiving from Israel are meaningful, assurances that Israel's providing with respect to law of war compliance, and then we can get into as well assurances relating to provision of humanitarian aid. So it's a real problem that the administration has needed to remedy for months now.
Mr. Finucane, you've advised the U.S. government in the past on military, on legal issues. Ms. Yeager, I believe you have too. Mr. Finucane, why don't you think that the U.S. government is doing the necessary assessments here?
Well, I think the answer is maybe inconvenient to the policy directive from the White House. The President of the United States has not signaled that yet that he is open to conditioning aid or enforcing the conditions already built into law with respect to arms transfers or U.S. military assistance. So that's an overarching reason. I also say just bureaucratically, the U.S. government is not set up to do this work in any sort of systematic fashion. It's frankly embarrassing that organizations like SARA's, organizations like Amnesty International, a number of news organizations that are doing open source research are doing a better job at analyzing the conduct of hostilities in Gaza and the use of U.S. weapons than the U.S. government seems to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, you say that it could be inconvenient, and certainly not just human rights organizations, but UN experts have called for the complete stopping of arms exports to Israel at the moment. And one country where we have seen restrictions put in place is, of course, the Netherlands, after a Dutch court ordered the Netherlands to halt the export of F-35 fighter jet parts to Israel, finding that there was a clear risk that they would be used to facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law. I believe that we can actually hear from one of the lawyers involved in that case. Let's listen.
The reason that we won is because the court said that exports to Israel cannot go ahead of arms supplies because of the risk that those arms are being used in human rights violations. And given that we now all know that so many states export to Israel and the overall presence of the Gaza conflict, it must lead for all the other countries as well to the conclusion that they should stop such export. As the rules that our court used to come to that conclusion are rules that are binding on, well, almost every state in the world. It's international humanitarian law, it's the Arms Trade Treaty, it's the European common position that says if there's a risk that arms will be used in human rights violations in the state of destiny, you cannot export. And that is a binding rule that takes priority over any other interest, be it self-defense of Israel, be it regional security, be it economic interest or diplomatic reasons.
Mr. Vries, let me bring you in. You're in Amsterdam. Just how much of a victory is that Dutch court ruling for groups such as yourself?
Well, to be honest, we were absolutely astonished that this court case was won, because in many other cases, the Dutch court had ruled that this decision should be a political decision and should not be based on juridical grounds, because all this legislation, like many other kinds of international legislation, also the European arms export rules, leave a little bit of political room for maneuver. And this is, of course, deliberate, because governments want to control and decide on their own arms export and not have it too restricted. But I think the fact that there's also a clear risk of genocide has certainly influenced the Dutch court and has certainly strengthened the opinion of the Dutch lawyers.
Yeah.
So it's not only a big victory in this specific case, but it is also a big victory in all the arms export control situations, because it says human rights are more important than any other considerations, and states have to make provisions to take care that human rights violations will not happen.
Okay, and certainly that is written into law. And Ms. Jaeger, as we heard from the lawyer there, it's the Dutch court is just responding to rules and laws that many other countries must abide by. Mr. Vries brought up the International Court of Justice's ruling. Just how much does the, world's top court ruling in January that there is a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza by Israel, how much does that, highlight the need, strengthen the call for an arms embargo on Israel? And could and should we be seeing other cases like the one in the Netherlands?
I do think so. It highlights the need in very stark relief. And I'm surprised, in fact, that the U.S. government has not followed suit, or at least put on the table to Israel the threat of conditioning aid or suspending aid. There's also this issue of Israel blocking humanitarian aid. That is also not legal according to U.S. laws that govern support to Israel. So if Israel is blocking humanitarian aid, the U.S. government is supposed to cut off all support to Israel. And I think the airdrops that you've seen the United States do, the building of a port off the coast of Gaza, these things say very clearly, we know that Israel is blocking our aid, and that's why we have to take these other extreme measures that are very inefficient and, in fact, sometimes dangerous to civilians.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to know that your memorandum not just mentions the use of, U.S. weapons on the war, but Israel systematically blocking aid. Mr. Finucane, I want to talk to you about individual responsibility. The U.S. Secretaries of State and Defense have to determine whether Israeli assurances of not violating international law are credible. And UN experts have warned that state officials, involved in the export of arms that are then used in gross violations of international human law can be criminally liable. So could U.S. officials, do you think, be prosecuted at courts such as the International Criminal Court under universal jurisdiction?
So I think it's necessary to distinguish between legal standards and then the enforcement of those standards before any court or body. So the U.S. itself recognizes that if an individual provides practical assistance that facilitates law of war violations, war crimes, the individual could be complicit as an aider and abetter of war crimes. And the U.S. has invoked this standard in the prosecution of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for the 9/11 attacks down in Guantanamo Bay. So this is a standard that the United States government itself is relying upon. But the question is then, how is that standard ever going to be enforced? Do I think it's likely in the near term that U.S. officials stand trial, for example, in Europe under universal jurisdiction in any particular European state? No, I don't think it's likely. But the chances are not zero, particularly over the long term, because people have long memories when it comes to atrocity crimes. The U.S. itself is engaged in trying to build up norms relating to accountability. So to me, it's not impossible to conceive that decades down the road, U.S. officials may have trouble if they want to travel to Europe.
Sure, but you think it's not likely because of political reasons, it sounds like. But legally, could there be a case?
I think it would depend on the laws of any particular jurisdiction, what the laws are relating to the domestic laws in terms of enforcing the law of war. I think that it will depend upon their domestic standards on complicity or aiding and abetting. The standard on aiding and abetting is somewhat higher at the International Criminal Court than it is under customary international law, under the law that the U.S. is trying to apply at Guantanamo Bay. So it really will depend on the laws of individual states, as well as political will, as you indicate.
Okay, and Ms. de Vries, let me bring you in here because Mr. Finucane was talking about, different standards in different courts. And this has been in court, this Israel supplying, or different countries supplying Israel with weapons, has been in the High Court of Justice in London, for example. And the court ruled that the risk of weapons being used in violation of international humanitarian law wasn't clear enough, and so that it couldn't order the UK government to stop its weapons transfers. Do you think the court's decision is out of step with the information that's available, with international consensus?
Well, I think this arms trade case in the Netherlands was under Dutch law. I mean, there is European legislation, but it is implemented in Dutch law, and so every country can use its own legal system to respond in this situation. I'm not sure if international law can overrule that. I mean, that's a different kind of system, and much less enforceable. But there is a tendency in European policies to always want to have one common standard for this kind of things. So if we can convince other European countries that this is the standard for arms export, other European countries confirm to this.
Okay, Ms. Jaeger, let me bring you in here on what the High Court of Justice in London ruled, because the criticism, including from your own organisation, is that the licences that the UK uses to transfer weapons to Israel are incredibly opaque. I mean, how problematic is that for collecting information about what's being transferred and then holding people to account?
Sure. Well, the whole system is opaque, and the United States has done this as well for the past few months. The Biden administration has fast-tracked weapons to Israel, and it has also used a threshold. So there is a threshold under which, if the weapons are small enough, if the package is small enough, that the Biden administration does not actually need to notify Congress that these weapons are going. And that, of course, it's legal, but it's an end run around democracy. And speaking of things that are important but not legal, I think a lot of what we're talking about is the court of public opinion. And of course, many populations around the world are extraordinarily upset with the United States, and it really has a credibility problem now, whether or not these legal questions fall in its favor.
And Mr. Finucane, who's at risk of prosecution? We've spoken about US officials, but what about the companies themselves who are manufacturing, whether it's weapons, ammunition, technology? Could companies or could individuals within those companies be liable?
Well, it's not impossible, but if you just look at the standards that states such as the United States have accepted as reflecting the law of war and for aiding and abetting, again, such as the standard the U.S. has adopted in the 9/11 trial at Guantanamo. But I think it's unlikely, at least in the near term. But again, these norms about accountability are growing. The U.S. is trying to reinforce them, including in connection with Russia's war in Ukraine. And so it's within the realm of possibility that decades down the road, not just U.S. officials involved in facilitating arms transfers that enable war crimes, but also, personnel or officials in companies may also face potential legal exposure, particularly abroad.
And if people, if companies, if states are found criminally liable, if and when this does come into a court of law, what kind of sentences, what kind of repercussions would we be looking at?
So I think we're talking about a few different things here. One are sort of the state-to-state litigation that's taking place before the International Court of Justice in the challenge that South Africa brought under the Genocide Convention. There's a separate issue about the criminal prosecution of individuals, be individuals, not states, being criminally prosecuted. I think it would depend on the jurisdiction that any charges were brought in, but judging from past domestic, prosecutions, including, under universal jurisdiction, you're looking at potentially decades in prison for serious law of war violations.
Okay, I mean, that's indeed very serious if it does come in front of a court. Again, Ms. de Vries, since you are in Amsterdam and it's where we've seen a successful case, what do you say to, all of those when we talk about the court of public opinion who would like countries like the US, the UK, Germany, France, Australia and Canada to stop funding Israel, to take the advice of UN experts who are calling for an arms embargo? What can they do?
Well, I think they should, you can try a lawsuit, but it's quite expensive, but you should also continue to have political actions, to protest in front of arms factories, to protest in front of your Ministry of Economic Affairs, who is deciding on the arms exports. I think to continue political protest and continue political pressure is actually the right way to do it, because it's of course sort of dramatic for democracy that we have to go to court to ask our governments to keep international humanitarian standards. I mean, governments should do that. Politicians should decide to keep these standards.
Okay.
But we should certainly continue to demonstrate.
And to keep up the pressure. Ms. Jaeger, we played some comments from the EU foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, earlier, who was saying that if the US is so concerned about the mounting death toll in Gaza, that they should send less weapons. I found those comments really interesting because UN experts have said that, as well as stopping sending weapons, there are so many other things that, parties to the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide can do, including sanctions. Now, Josep Borrell can criticize the US sending arms to Israel, but do you think that the EU can also be doing much more in sanctioning Israel in other ways?
So I think any state or group of states that is worried about how Israel is conducting this campaign in Gaza, there are quite a lot of tools in their toolkit, one of which is, of course, sanctioning. And just to say, President Biden put out an executive order a few months ago that allows him to sanction some of the violent West Bank settlers, including Israeli officials who are inciting that violence and or giving weapons to those West Bank settlers. So this is possible. The United States has it in its toolkit. I think a lot of other countries have it in their toolkit. The question is when they are going to use it. And I think it's long past time.
Mr. Finucane, do you agree that it's long past time? Could we see a change in how much or how severely Israel is sanctioned?
Look, the outcome here that the U.S. should change its approach to providing weapons and military assistance to Israel is overdetermined. It's overdetermined because of U.S. law, policy, international law. It's overdetermined due to the obstruction of and restrictions on humanitarian assistance, which Sarah referred to a moment ago. And overarchingly, it's overdetermined because this war has been a catastrophe. 30,000 people have been killed. Gaza is facing famine. And this conflict has sparked a regional war, which the U.S. is now directly involved in, including with the Houthis in Yemen and the Red Sea. And so the U.S. needs to stop being an arsonist in this situation and quit throwing more fuel on the fire and try to extinguish it, including by using the leverage that it has with Israel. And arms transfers are a significant form of leverage.
And Ms. Yeager, we had some very interesting comments from the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer a few days ago, talking about the leverage that the U.S. has with Israel and how it should be using more leverage because of how it's conducting this war on Gaza. Now, many people thought that he could have been hinting at conditioning U.S. military aid. What do you think of that?
So for those in the audience who don't know Chuck Schumer, this is a remarkable speech by a Democrat who has been very close to Israel, very close to supporters of Israel here in the United States. I think what it shows is a real shift in how Congress, which has responsibility for oversight on arms transfers, is thinking about this conflict. And so, yeah, he does have the kind of influence that could put conditioning of weapons on the table to Israel as a threat. But of course, President Biden still has not been willing to do that. So he's really the one that needs to be convinced.
Okay, and Mr. Rees, I want to ask you about something that's happening in Amsterdam, because even though the Dutch court has ruled that the Netherlands can't be sending parts of F-35 fighter jets to Israel, I've read that the Dutch government is trying to find other ways of doing this. So just, why is it so important then for countries to keep supplying weapons to Israel? And how do you really make sure that it happens, even if you have a court ruling in hand?
Well, I think you cannot look at the Israeli-Palestine conflict in isolation. It's part of a broader international power structure, military power structure, in which Israel is very important. And also the Israeli arms industry is important in the whole network of international arms industry. For many countries in Europe, of course, following the United States is a very important thing. And as long as the United States continues to support Israel, European countries, many European countries will also continue to support Israel with arms. So I also think when Mr. Borrell says we should stop arming Israel, why is the European Union then not saying, okay, we have an arms boycott on Israel? I mean, they can do that. They have the power to do that. And I think Europe has to really think about its own way and its own policies to follow and not continue following the United States, because I think we have our own European role to play in this.
Wendella de Vries, thank you very much for that. Thank you to all of our guests. That is Sarah Yeager in Washington, D.C., Wendella de Vries in Amsterdam, and Brian Finucane, also in Washington, D.C. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.